after Stalin died, it took a long time for the museum curators to be able to identify them, who owned them even. But nowadays, there's a great recognition of the contribution of both Morozov yesterday and Shukin today. Now, Shukin is here in a rather strange portrait. It's by a Norwegian artist called Jan Kron, and he studied in Russia and married a Russian lady, and then fled in 1917, like many people did, and it's in the Hermitage Museum. Now, Shukin was one of 5 brothers, inheritors to be of the textile empire, textile industry. And his father sent the 2 eldest brothers, or 2 eldest boys, to a boarding school in the Baltic, German run. And obviously it was to give them some international exposure, some sort of backbone really, to take over the business. Shukin, our Shukin, did not go in the same direction because he was a sickly child, and he also suffered very, very badly from a stammer. And this eventually was cured to a certain extent when he was sent by his father to consult a medical doctor in Germany. But he still stuttered throughout his life, and the more excited he got, the more he stuttered. So it was quite a feature when he took people around his gallery that he was endlessly stuttering. Now, he was... By the time the elder brothers had come back from their boarding school, it was very evident that the boy who had the most talent was Shukin, our Shukin, Sergei Shukin. And so it was decided that he would take over the textile industry. And it's said of him that he inherited a vibrant, very good organization and turned it into an empire. And he was an incredibly successful businessman. And it's so much so that amongst his peers in the merchant class, he was known as the Minister of Commerce. And he therefore was a very, very successful businessman without any training, without any knowledge whatsoever of art. But he grew up in a very cultured society. By then, with the wealth behind them, the merchant class was, as I say, patronizing a great deal of cultural events, cultural organizations. And all his 3 or 4 brothers were collectors of one form of art or another. So he was imbued in that. And in addition, he had 2 brothers who were living permanently by the 1890s in Paris. So he had a background. He had something to fall back on. And then by the 1880s, he married a famous Moscow beauty with whom he fell absolutely, totally in love. And after the birth of their first son, who was dutifully named after the grandfather, Ivan, it was decided that Shukin, our Shukin, would inherit a great mansion, a great palace that had been bought by the paterfamilias. And it is a palace called the Trubetskoy Palace, and it was owned by the ancient Russian aristocratic family of the Trubetskoy, who had then very foolishly gambled their entire fortune away. So it was sold to a mere merchant. And you can see there, it's a magnificent neoclassic building of the late 18th century. Now, it looks fairly compact, but it was a huge complex behind as well. And there you can see it in the snow. And what somebody on the computer has done, it not me, has actually, in the windows you see on the first floor, inserted color, which is a reminder that these rooms were filled with all the paintings and the color of those paintings, Matisse, Goga, Monet, and whatever, that you wouldn't really see it from the street, but it's a nice idea. Now, the central part of the palace, delineated by the pediment, is known as the Pink Room, or was known as the Pink Room, and it was where the Matisses were. On the right of that, as you look at this slide, was Monet and the Impressionists. On the left of that was the Gogas. And there were two other rooms, one filled with sort of the also-rans, and a fifth which was Picasso. And we'll deal with that tomorrow. Now, Shuken buys his first Western painting, first Impressionist painting, in 1898. And he only collects up until the First World War, because, as I say, the First World War stops, everything stops absolutely dead, because you can't get to Paris after that, because you had to travel across Germany. And in addition, the Russian banks forbid any transfer of money, transfer of funds outside the country, or whatever. But he buys his first Impressionist painting in 1898, and you can see it here. It's called the Rocks of Belle-Île. Belle-Île is a beautiful island. I did call there once on a cruise, but we spent all of about 2 hours there, but it was seemingly very pretty. It is an island off the southern coast of Brittany. It's in the Bay of Biscay, really. And Monet spent an autumn there. In the autumn of 1886, he's painting in Belle-Île, and he paints quite a number, 9 or 10 paintings, of this rock formation, which is called by the islanders the pyramids. It doesn't look like the pyramids, but it's called the pyramids. And it is, as you can see, the photograph as it looks today. And Monet obviously enhances this. He makes it you feel, as you look at this painting, as if it's a wonderful sort of windy day with a foam being activated by the wind and crashing against the rocks. It's got this amazing sense of light emanating from the foam. And it is a work of great significance in his career. And another work at the same time, purchased by Shuken, is an almost source Impressionist painting. It's the Lilacs of Argenteuil. Argenteuil was a sort of suburb of Paris, to the north of Paris, on the River Seine, and it is where Monet actually, at this time, the date is 1873, he was actually living in Argenteuil with his family. And it was a popular area for Monet's friends and associates. Renoir, who was a friend of Monet, Renoir will go there, and in fact Renoir paints some lovely paintings of the life of these young people on the banks of the Thames there, the Seine, I beg his pardon. And also Manet is a frequenter of Argenteuil, as is Caillebotte, another of this circle of friends. Now, here it has been suggested, and one cannot prove it, but this is probably the first time that Monet actually went out of doors with his easel to paint a painting. He went en plein air. He was painting the view as he saw it in front of him. He wasn't doing it in the studio. And that, of course, is one of the great elements of the Impressionist revolution. And here you can see this amazing sort of dots, almost punctilist effect of the leaves, the green leaves, the wonderful colors of the lilacs. And in fact, you can or should be able to make out under the trees, that is a lady with a parasol, and that is another lady leaning against the tree trunk. And it's got this amazing sort of decorative element in it. And these two paintings are amongst the first that Shuken collects. And he only has, really, about 12 years in which to assemble one of the finest, if not the finest, collection of Western art at that time in the world. And he has this inevitable, extraordinary eye that he can choose the best. Now, you can see these two paintings in his house. And there is the Monet room. And it's quite extraordinary for a day's work, isn't it, just to have this amazing array of paintings. It fascinates me. Now, what is so extraordinary, and thank goodness he took the decision, we don't know why. Of course, he never had time, really, to write his biography, so there are not a great deal of facts. There's quite a good book written about him now called The Collector. But what you see is modern art, as it was then, displayed in a palatial setting. And it's a very grand room, it's got a big spatial effect, it's got the chandeliers, it's got the neo-Baroque plasterwork in the ceiling, and so it is an extraordinary variance. The paintings are not very happily placed in these grand settings, but it works because of the quantity, basically. I mean, you just have to be amazed. Monet eventually will buy 13 Monets, Schucken will buy 13 Monets, and you see most of them here. And there you can see the rocks at the arrow's point. That's the rocks of Belle-Île, that's the lilacs, and next to it is, without any shadow of doubt, the finest example of Impressionist painting by Monet from his early career. It is the most wonderful painting. And here you can see it. It's called A Lady in a Garden in Saint-Andrés. Saint-Andrés is a suburb of Rouen, and it's on the coast. It's a holiday resort. It was a sort of 19th century resort. And you can see this symphony of green, this amazing, the leaves and the trees, and this amazing light that emanates from them. And what is so perfect, what is so relevant, is that the whole scene is drawn together by that figure in white. And it somehow is a focal point, but it allows you to enjoy that extraordinary beauty that he's painted. And when you think that Monet here is in his 27th year, he's only 26, 27 when he paints this, it shows that from the outset, Monet was a man of incredible talent. And it is one of the treasures, literally one of the treasures of the Hermitage today, and is one of the great paintings, if not the greatest, by Monet at this time. I mean, it's an early work, but it's in the Hermitage Museum. And the garden that you look at is the garden of his cousin. Monet's cousin had a house in Saint-Andrés. So here is the cousin's garden with, in fact, the cousin's wife as the lady in white. And so it's a very personal thing. And so here again, you can see the same room, but looking the other way. And here is the Monet room, or the music room, with the same paintings. Now, we saw this one yesterday. That is the haystack that I mentioned, with the rain-washed field. There's the lady in white, and then the other two paintings I've just shown you. I'll be showing you the water lilies, I'll be showing you Rouen Cathedral, I'll be showing you that painting, which is actually Pissarro. And the end wall is a painting by Monet again, and it is the one we saw yesterday. It's the Houses of Parliament, painted during his visits to London, if you remember, 1899, 1900, 1901. Now, in the corner at the end wall, and the end wall, it's not the end wall, the corner of the wall, which leads you into the Matisse room, in the corner there is another absolutely source example of Monet's work, and it is the Déjeuner sur l'herbe. Now, this is slightly complex, and I'll just briefly discuss this painting, but I'm not going to discuss it in detail because next week, some of you will probably be going to the lectures by Hilary Guise, who's lecturing on 5 specific paintings, 1 per day. And one of them is the Déjeuner sur l'herbe by Manet, Edouard Manet. And so she'll undoubtedly discuss this painting, or hopefully she does. And when she does, you'll say to yourself, oh, I know all about that one now. And you can be sort of chuffed up by it. Now, it is painted in reaction to Manet's painting. Manet's painting is 1863. And that's as much as I'll say of that. This painting is largish. As you saw, it was on the wall. It's quite large, over 1 meter high and 1 meter long. And it is obviously a very lovely, elegant picnic in the forest of Fontainebleau, with all the light filtering through the trees, the lovely reflected light on the leaves. And he uses as his model for the women, there are 5 women in this painting, and he uses as his model one person who is his wife. Because he's a young man, he's 25 when he's painting this, and he can't afford a model, so he just uses his wife. Similarly, the men are all based on a friend of his who's a fellow artist called Frederick Basile. And it's a sort of really rather jolly communal effort here, because although it's very elegant and very refined. And this, as I say, is the basis for the lecture which Hilary will be giving next week. Now, but there we'll go back to his series. Now, we've discussed the Haystack series yesterday. We've discussed the Houses of Parliament. And in between those two is the Rouen Cathedral series. He paints 30 paintings of the cathedral facade, the west facade of Rouen Cathedral. He will, like in London, he'll rent a room overlooking the cathedral. And I placed in the middle there an 1890 photograph of the cathedral as it was then. Well, of course, it hasn't really changed very much, except it's now being cleaned. It was badly damaged in the war, so it's been restored, but it's the same cathedral. And what is interesting is that now we're talking about the 1890s. Could you all just think for a moment and turn your phones off? Be rather a good idea. And in Rouen Cathedral here in 1890 that he's buying these paintings, it is, he pays enormous prices. He pays on average 20,000 francs. And if you use that multiple of 6, it gets to over 100,000, which is a lot of money, even then. I mean, a lot of money then particularly. So he's earning good money by the 1890s. And not that he will get all this, of course, because the dealers are going to get their very large cut, of course. But anyway, we see these 2 paintings, part of the series of 30 or so, which he paints over 1 year. 1 year and a half. And on the left-hand side is, well, actually, it's on your... Yes, it is your left. On the left-hand side is the cathedral with that bright light of the midday sun, and then, of course, in the evening, it's the sunset with the more softer, warmer light on the right. And this is part of the series, but the most significant series, the most beautiful series, is his water lilies, les nymphères. And he purchased Giverny, as I mentioned yesterday, in 1883. Now, he couldn't afford much in those days. He simply bought that little house, which is now much bigger, of course. He bought the little bit of garden, and that was it. But by the 1890s, of course, he's now making good money, and he can afford to buy a plot of land adjacent to his existing property. And that plot of land has a pond in it, on it. And so the pond will then, he'll buy this in about 1891. So over that period between now 1891 and 1899, he'll create his water lily garden. And then he'll build across the water lily garden his famous bridge, which is called, for no particular reason, Japanese bridge. It could equally be Chinese, or anyway, it's Oriental in influence. And this is in the Pushkin Museum today, and it is his finest series, the Water Lily series. He'll continue right through to the very end of his life painting the water lilies, getting bigger and bigger and bigger canvases. You must have seen some in the Orangerie, but that's not the series I'm talking about. In the year 1899, he paints a dozen of this same view. And we'll look at it now on display in St. Petersburg. It's an exhibition of Monet. Now, I'm showing you this just to clarify what and how the Impressionists in St. Petersburg are displayed. Now, you can see at the top left-hand side, you can see the Hermitage, which is the Palace of the Tsars. Now, the arrow on the far left, the arrow on the right point towards the area of what is this huge semicircle of buildings, which is called the General Staff. They're a very famous piece of St. Petersburg architecture, in fact, and they're by a man called Rossi. But this semicircle is designed originally in the early 19th century, partly for the regiments of the Tsar, who will protect him in the Winter Palace, which is across the square, and partly for the civil service. It's a huge series of rooms. And when communism fell, the director of the Hermitage Museum, who's still there today, he's a very famous man, he took the opportunity to acquire part of the general staff. The arrow on the right-hand side points to the area that he acquired. And he has, over the years, it's now about 10 years since it opened, he has created these beautiful, modern, air-conditioned, properly lit galleries. So no longer can you say that you've seen the Impressionists in the squalid conditions of the attic floor of the Hermitage. They're now in their own special designated place. And there you can see in this display are the water lilies. That is the haystacks, which we saw yesterday, purchased by Morozov. And there is the rocks of Belle Isle we've just looked at. So you see the Impressionist paintings now properly displayed in St. Petersburg. Now, back to the water lilies. This is a photograph in the records, in the archives of Duan Ruel, through whom Monet would have purchased this painting. And there it is in its entirety on the right. 1899. Now, in that year, he paints 12. Now, you can see it here amongst 5 others. There, you see, they're dotted around the world: Moscow, Philadelphia, London, Princeton, Washington, Paris. Now, it is generally accepted, generally acknowledged, that the Moscow painting, purchased by Shukin, is of this dozen, there are 6 more, of this dozen paintings, the Moscow painting is the best. And it reminds us that we know this from Matisse. Matisse, of course, was patronized enormously, as we shall see tomorrow, by Shukin. But Shukin would write from Moscow and say, I'm coming next month on the train to Paris. I hope to see you and hope to examine have a viewing of your latest works. So we'd get to Matisse's studio, and Matisse would say, here are my works in the room, and there's only one, that's in the left-hand corner, that's not for sale, all the others are for sale. So Shukin will go around, he'll probably be accompanied by one of his sons, or perhaps by his brother, or perhaps by a friend, and he'll go around quietly thinking, very slowly, very, very meticulously, and at the end he'll come to Monet and say, actually, I want that one in the left-hand corner, please. And always he chooses the best, because obviously what Matisse is doing is keeping back the painting he thinks is his best. And this is exactly the same with what happens here. He has this instinctive eye, and it is instinctive. I mean, just as you can be a famous wine connoisseur, but by having this particular palate, it just happens to be in Shukin's makeup, and he is the most extraordinary man for the ability to attract the best. And he writes about the fact that when he stands in front of a painting, quite often he gets a little sort of electric shock going through him, because he knows this is the one he's got to buy. It's quite extraordinary, really. Anyway, here we move on to 2 other Impressionists who were part and parcel of the great group who we were discussing. And on the bottom right, you can see Pissarro painting the Place du Théâtre Français, which is 1898, Hermitage Museum. Both these in Hermitage. And Pissarro will do exactly what Monet has done. He'll rent a room in what in fact is an existing hotel today, the Hotel du Louvre, and he'll paint the view onto the square, the theatre square. And it's spring, of course. The leaves are out. And Pissarro is very, very decorative. He's very, very pretty. He's an excellent, excellent artist. He's enormously prolific. And slightly older than the others, but also a very good sort of advisor, helper, and so on, to the Impressionist movement. But he's very prolific, and you'll find Pissarro's dotted around many, many, many galleries across Europe, America, and elsewhere. Now, in this painting, you see the green leaves, and at the same time, it's actually from the light, which is hitting the square. You see it's rather cold, it's rather sort of bleak. People are still in thick clothes, and they're queuing to get onto horse-drawn buses, because the date is 1898, and they're queuing to get onto horse-drawn buses, normally to get onto the top floor and sit in the exposed, freezing cold air. And no wonder you died young, because you had all these indignities to cope with. Similarly, the painting at the top left is by the artist Alfred Sisley, and it is a village on the Seine, and it's 1872 in the Hermitage again. Now, Sisley was born in France of British parentage, and he does paint some rather lovely English paintings, mainly of London, but South London, but he lives and works in France. And he's again a struggling artist, like they all were to begin with. And here you can see this shadow, the shade, the rather lovely leafy shade in which he's placed his easel, and then he's looking across the Seine towards the blinding hot light of a summer's day. And you can see the sort of difference of the two. It's very, very effective, and he's a very gay. These two artists, not quite as profound as Monet, but still very much in the same idiom, and very much in this whole school of the Impressionist painters. They're exhibiting at the same time as Monet in these exhibitions. Now, here we'll just finish this with looking at both sides of the room. You're looking down on the right-hand side towards the end wall, and on the left-hand side you're looking towards the exit from the room through the Matisse Gallery to Goga. And in this room you'll get 13 works by Monet, 4 by Degas, 2 by Pissarro, 2 by Suzanne, 1 by Sisley, 1 by Maurice Denis, and 4 others. Once Shukin makes up his mind, he just goes for it, and he buys more and more and more paintings. And this is quite evident with the later paintings we'll see tomorrow. Now, we'll go through the Matisse Gallery. You won't see it today. And then you go through to the Goga room. Now, the end wall, just to confuse matters, are 3 Matisses. These were specifically placed in this position by Shukin, having been ordered from Matisse, and they're there so that the colors of Matisse can, as it were, talk to and bounce off the Gauguin colors, and the two of them can sort of get to know each other. And now, Shukin, year by year, is collecting more and more and more. He was becoming an absolute sort of passion, obsession almost. And he was always, certainly by the 1900s, very keen to show off his collection. And on a Saturday, anybody actually who pitched up could be taken round the collection. Now, anybody in those days meant some of his friends, of course, some of the other merchant class, some critics, some artists, some academics. That was about it. I mean, it wasn't the general thing to do in those days, but word got round amongst those who were interested, and they were taken round by Shukin. Shukin, as I say, getting more and more excited, stuttering more and more and more as he went round. And generally, the reaction was negative. Generally, Shukin's friends would say, what absolute nonsense you're buying. You know, why are you doing all this, spending all your money on all this absolute rubbish? But then some people, more advanced critics, and there's one on record, who then said this room was like a Goga iconostasis. It's like a sort of religious thing. And you see the iconostasis here. There are 16 paintings by Goga, collected specifically to be placed in that room. And they're by Goga, obviously. The only odd man out, they're all but painted in Tahiti, except for the one on the far right there, which is a little still life, which he paints earlier. But all the others are by, Goga is not painted in Tahiti either. But Goga, who is this very, very self-opinionated man, an egoist of all proportions, decides in 1891 to abandon his family. He has a wife, he has 4 or 5 children, and he abandons them because he can't stand France. France is too bourgeois, France is too self-satisfied. He finds the people arrogant and whatever, and he's going to find an ideal area where mankind hasn't yet corrupted the people. And he has these extraordinary ideas. And so he decides to go to Tahiti, and which is the end of the world, basically. I mean, you travel for 2.5 months to get there. And he decides in 1891 to travel to Tahiti, and was determined to go there, get there, and he did. And he stays in Tahiti from 1891 to 1893. That's his first visit. After which he returns to France, and then he returns back to Tahiti in 1895 until his death in 1903. And it is during the first and second periods in Tahiti that he paints these works. Now, just to sort of show you briefly, this is the island of Tahiti. And actually, when you look at it, it's the most extraordinary shape. It looks like a lady's mirror on an old-fashioned toilet table. It looks like a sort of old-fashioned lady's mirror. And the capital is Papeete. Papeete is up the top, together with, what am I doing? Pushing the wrong one. There's Papeete, somewhere. There's an aeroplane. And it's the capital. Papeete is at the top. Now, he didn't think this through, of course, because actually he was leaving all these prejudices and all this self-satisfied smugness that he felt people he could get away from. Well, they're going to be the same sort of people in Tahiti. They're colonials. They're going to be even more self-satisfied and smug. And he finds it absolutely impossible to live there. He alienates everybody. He also had this idea that once he arrived, they would queue up to have their portrait painted. When he paints one portrait, it's so badly, it's so unkind to the sitter that nobody else, because the sitter obviously was a lady and she thought herself she should show off her jewels and whatever. Well, he shows her as an absolute whatever. And so nobody then asked to have their portrait painted. In addition, I do think, apart from seeking this ideal world of innocence and whatever, I do think perhaps just a tiny spark in his mind was that I'm sure over conversations in the bars, in dinner parties and so on, particularly with the male-only conversation, that Goga had heard and realized that that the ladies of the South Seas were very open and free with their favors, so that I think this might have just been a little thought in his mind. And so then, in Papeete, he finds a mistress. He always liked young girls. She's 17 years old. And they then move to the south of the island, which is really why I'm showing this to you. And here, to the south of the island, is a town called Matea, and there is now today a museum there. I don't think it has any Gogas in it, but it is to commemorate his life there. He settles down in Matea, and actually, to be quite honest, he then does find a certain satisfaction, because he's away from the colonial mishmash, and he can he starts painting very seriously, and paints very prolifically, of course, sending back paintings to Vollard, the artist, the dealer rather, who was promoting him, and he will live in Matea, building a little sort of mud hut for himself and his girlfriend, his mistress. And here you can see 2 paintings from the first Tahitian period, and they're both world famous. The first one on the left her name is Varumati. Now what he does is name all his paintings that he paints in Tahiti. They all have a title written on them. You can maybe just make it out if you look at the sand there. That is the title of that painting. And that's the title of the painting. He entitles all of them in Tahitian words. Because obviously, if you've got a mistress who's 17 years old, and she's probably not very well educated, she probably doesn't know more than 2 words of French, you've got to learn their language. I mean, you can't live with her for ages without speaking. So he was a very clever man, Goga. He's a very intelligent man. And he obviously was quite a good linguist, but anyway, he learns the language. And you see Varumati, the girl there on the left-hand side, who is there in sort of primitive, the world that he expected to find in Tahiti, and of course didn't. In this primitive world where the god of the island, whose name is Ovo, and you could see the big figure looming above her on the right-hand side of the painting, the Ovo will actually spy her, and it's a sort of story that any culture has in its compendium. And from their union come the people of the South Seas. So it's a sort of lovely idea. It's a sort of imaginary story, which didn't, because again, these beliefs which Goga thought he would be able to encounter in Tahiti have all been obliterated by 100 years of missionaries who'd been there before him. So they've all been converted to Christianity. Anyway, there's a house, the sort of house that he would have lived in, would have built for himself. And then the painting on the right-hand side is arguably his finest work. He was inspired by Tahiti. He certainly was, and he certainly went there with, and got enormous credit, enormous ability to paint there, because he obviously adored the colour, the light, the vegetation, the lushness of it all, the relaxed qualities of it all. And we know about this painting because he kept a diary, which eventually he publishes. He's always desperate to make some sort of money, which he never does. And he wrote a diary called Noa Noa, N-O-A, N-O-A. And he, in the diary, writes about the fact that he saw these 2 sisters. He's in this little village, so everybody knows each other. And he's in that little village of Metea, and he sees these 2 ladies sitting on the seashore, chatting. Now, under no circumstance would they have been chatting and sitting there completely nude. That, again, is his fertile imagination. They would have had sarongs on. They probably would have exposed their upper body, but they would have had sarongs on. But they're city there, and this is what he's trying to present to us. It's this ideal world that it had escaped him. But there are these beautiful poses of the girl is in the front, the one behind. The girl in the front, by the way, is probably his mistress. And he imagines that these 2 people he sees sitting on the beach are chatting away, and he imagines they're talking, and the title is, What? Are You Jealous? And in fact, they're meant to be talking about their sex lives. Well, I mean, really, and they're talking about the price of pudding or the price of whatever. You know, they're not interested. They wouldn't be talking. Anyway, this is Goga for you. And anyway, he paints this beautiful painting, these wonderful figures, this sense of calm, this sense of balance, this sense of harmony, which he's illustrating here. And it's on the seashore, the white sand with the blue sea. But then, of course, the person who's dismissed the painting as Goga, well, the sea doesn't have colours in it. Well, of course, it does have colours in it. On a bright, bright day, you can see colour on the sea, not only blue. And so, therefore, he's imagining this wonderful seascape here in Tahiti. And it is, as I say, one of his greatest, if not his greatest work. Now, he goes back to France for 2 years. By the time he goes back in 93, by the way, he's got absolutely no money at all. 0. He manages, quite extraordinarily, to persuade the French government to actually repatriate him. So he goes back to Paris for free. In Paris, he then managed to somehow recoup some of his losses. He actually gets an inheritance from an uncle, a small legacy, which, of course, he doesn't divide with his family. It's all for moi, you see. It's all for me. And he then goes back to Tahiti in 1895 and will remain in the South Seas until his death in 1903. He doesn't die in Tahiti. He dies in another series of islands, also French-owned, which are called the Marquesas Islands, Marquesas. Now, in the second visit, he paints here a very moving painting, which on the left-hand side is the Nativity. He entitles it Bebe, and it's in the Hermitage Museum. Both these are in the Hermitage. And this is a very poignant moment, because when he returns to Tahiti, he has another mistress, and she will give birth to a child, which dies within days of its birth. And she, as you see, she's the virgin and child, basically, but she's got this terribly sad face, and there she's got this dead child on her lap. And there's the angel of death in the background. But it is a nativity scene. He's imposing Western ideas, because it is a manger with the animals. It's the birth of Christ, really. And it's a very moving thing. But again, he recreates his image of Tahiti in this. He does all the time, of course. Here on the right-hand side, it's called the Month of Mary. And again, the critics say, well, the trees are never blue, the sky's never yellow. Well, of course, it could be yellow and blue. I mean, why does it matter? It's just because these colors are so vibrant. He's so influenced by the colors of Tahiti, as is the vegetation, that amazing flowers in the sky. And she, the girl there, is slightly supplicant. She's bending down with an offering. And this is, again, what he imagines would be the element of Tahiti would be like. Similarly, he imposes Western ideas upon a Tahitian scene, and this is particularly relevant here in what is the king's wife. There was no king in Tahiti when Goga was there, but he imagines one. And this is his wife. And what he's doing there with this lady lying in the nude is copying Western art. Titian did it in the 1500s. Goya did it. He paints the famous painting of the Duchess of Alba in the nude, which is in the Prado today. He's just simply copying Western art and placing that figure. It is one of his greatest works. And he's placing it in a Tahitian context with the wonderful light on the trees, the blue of the sea, and the growth, and so on. And similarly there, the idol. The idol is on the right-hand side, both with that idol in the Hermitage, the King's Wife, and the Pushkin. And there again, the idol, which is the qualities that he misses. He thought there'd be this local traditions and local beliefs, which he never found. Now, the biggest painting, which is the sort of focal center of the big display of Goga, it's in the Pushkin Museum. It's called The Fruit Harvest, but in Tahitian song, we get this again from his diary, that there's a song saying everything's perfect in Tahiti, or life is good in Tahiti. We live a lovely life in Tahiti. It's a sort of folk song, which is called Rupe Rupe. And it's what his ladies in his life would be singing as they sweep the floor or something. You know, he's used to this song. And what he's doing here is summing up all that he wants and got from Tahiti. He's got the amazing color, the amazing light, the simplicity of it all. The girl there in the center is picking fruit. Well, in other words, it's a sort of primitive, simple world. It's the Garden of Eden, basically. She's Eve taking the apple from the tree. Similarly, again, there's two other girls sort of slightly offering some obeisance to the gods. The chap and the nude fellow riding, the horse is at rest, the horse is eating the grass. Everything is calm, balanced, relaxed. And this is what he finds and what he represents. But of course, he never makes any money because he can't sell his paintings. And much as Vollard tries to help him, eventually Vollard will actually pay him a stipend. And seeing the greatness of Goga, but nobody else is doing so, he's a decade beyond, in front of everybody in Paris. But eventually he will secure some sort of financial stability by Vollard paying him a little money, but at least it's better than nothing. And he will live then eventually. But sadly, as I say, he eventually goes north to the Marquesas Islands, where he dies in a tragic death. He's only 53, and he dies of a whole host of problems, including syphilis. So that's poor old Goga for you. Now, what is so interesting is that then, and I can see Vollard, the dealer, persuading Shukin, because he'll say, look, sir, I've got these two Van Goghs. I know you're not very keen on Van Gogh, but they relate to Goga, and you've got the 16 Goga collection, and here these two relate. And they are both by Van Gogh, and both purchased, of course, from Vollard by Shukin. And here, Vincent van Gogh painting the memory of the garden at Ettin. Ettin was the town in which Van Gogh's father lived. Van Gogh's father, as you know, was a preacher. And he lived, his parish was Ettin. And so in 1888 he paints this. Now 1888 is the year when Goga stays with Van Gogh. And you can sort of, perhaps be pushing it a bit, but you can see that path, that splash of colour, is sort of very Gauguin-esque. And anyways, and then the lady in blue with the shawl over her head is his mother, and the lady with black hair is his elder sister. And so he's looking back to his past, rather sort of nostalgically. Then, of course, as you know, Goga and Van Gogh had this fight. Van Gogh cuts off his hair, and his brother then encourages him to go to the psychiatric hospital. And in the hospital, he paints the Lilac Bush. It's the Lilac Bush in the grounds of the psychiatric hospital. So they're both very relevant to the story of the interrelationship between Goga and Van Gogh. And there you can see the two paintings. Now, you can make them all out. You can see the big painting of Rupe here. You can see the Van Goghs. And then a lot of the others we've seen. The famous one, I can't, I guess it's up there. It's up there somewhere. That's Are You Jealous? Now, as I say, we'll discuss the end wall on the right, on the left-hand side. We'll discuss that tomorrow because those are three Matisses. But what is interesting, if you look at the right-hand side, is that there is at the end wall a tapestry. And it is a tapestry designed by Edward Burne-Jones, who was the pre-Raphaelite acolyte. And I think it sort of clashes a bit. It's not. It was ordered by Shukin. This was commissioned. It was actually made at the William Morris Tapestry Factory, specifically at the behest of Shukin. So it's something he wanted. But we don't know what his mind was moving towards. If the World War had never taken place, First World War had never happened, if the revolution had never occurred, then he could have gone on, he would have gone on collecting, there's absolutely no dispute about that. But he could have been going into a different direction, perhaps to buy the pre-Raphaelites in England. We don't know. Certainly what we do know is that if he did go on buying, he'd have to enlarge his palace. But anyway, that's beside the point. And he, by the way, was intending to leave his collection, together with his palace, to the nation. It's in his first will. Once he has to flee, which he does, he flees leaving everything. He flees without a suitcase, without a penny in his pocket. He flees to Germany and then to France. He had, as I say, already transferred his wealth, so it wasn't as if he was poverty-stricken. But he certainly, it was the most unsatisfactory thing to do. Anyway, there we go. Now, one of the back rooms is still chock-a-block full with famous paintings. This is what's so extraordinary. And look at the one, as you see there, Degas, Renoir, Cézanne, Denis, Puvis de Chavannes, and the painting on the right of the doorway, as you look at it here, is the famous Bellan. It must rank as one of the finest nudes ever painted. It's this extraordinary beauty of this girl, this sort of self-confidence of this girl. She looks out towards you. She was a model, but she was one of the circle again of these friends of Renoir, of Monet, and so on. This circle of friends would all be meeting at the Moulin de la Galette or whatever. And there she is. And what is so interesting is that Renoir is well known for the fact that he together with Rubens some centuries before, are the only two Western artists who have an ability to actually paint convincing white flesh, because flesh isn't white. And what's emphasizing that is that wonderful sort of sweep of cold grey colours, cold bluey grey colours in the background. And there she comes out towards you from that. And it is a tremendously fine work of art. Now, what is interesting, I told you that the family of the Shukins were old believers. They were Christian, and they were part of the Russian Orthodox Church. But the old believers are very, very strict. And Shukin was always averse to buying nudes. But this painting actually was bought by his brother, Peter. And Peter obviously also at the back of his mind thought, oh dear, you know, the Russian Orthodox Church are going to be very cross about this. And so he didn't place it in his entrance hall. He didn't place it in his drawing room. He placed it in a corner of his bedroom, and so that only he could look at it. And then eventually Peter will sell it, because he was involved with a rather messy divorce. He'll sell it to Shukin in 1910, by which stage I think Shukin felt he had also by then suffered huge sadnesses in his life. He'd lost a son who committed suicide. He'd lost his wife, who he worshipped. And he went, in fact, on a pilgrimage in 1907 to escape from Moscow for a bit. And then eventually I think he must have said, look, this is exactly what I want to do. I don't care a damn what anybody says. I want to buy what I want and I admire. And so I think by then he was inured to any criticism. But this was part of his collection. Now here again is the Renoir. Renoir not only, can paint flesh, he can also paint black. Just as Van Dyck, alone of the artists of the Western art, can paint black. I mean, there's shades of black. If you see the girl there, she's got darker buttons than the costume she wears. Her hat is in different shades of black. And it's extraordinary ability to do that. And there is this lovely, lovely little intimate chat by these two girls, by Renoir. It's in the Pushkin Museum. And here again, the famous painting of the girl brushing her hair. This, by the way, was displayed by Degas with other nude paintings in the 8th Impressionist exhibition. I mentioned the first Impressionist exhibition in that room overlooking the Boulevard de Capucines was in 1874. The last exhibition was 1886. And this painting was in that exhibition. And again, it's purchased for a great deal of money. These paintings are now going for lots of money, well, I suppose because they're nudes. But it's also purchased by Peter, the brother, and it's also then only shown in his bedroom, so that it's only favoured guests that get a look. And this painting the Degas is one of his most famous. It's pastel on paper, which of course is terribly fragile, terribly, terribly, terribly fragile. So I don't think it's generally lent to exhibitions these days. And if they do, they're very silly. Now here again, you get a Suzanne. This, unfortunately, like most of Suzanne's sitters, we don't know who she is. And whereas if you have a smoker from the local village bar, it's not that important, but this must have been some woman of standing. She's dressed in her Sunday best. She's dressed very, very well. And she looks slightly mournful. She's very pensive. And I also think she looks like a younger Maggie Smith. But she's probably painted in Gauguin's studio, in Petit, I'm getting Gauguin on the mind. Cézanne's studio, you can see the cushions there from the studio on the right-hand side here, on the left-hand side. And she's a very, very good example of Cézanne's work as it develops from the 1890s into the 1900s. This is in the gallery as well. Now, again, you can see here the Belan. Those two are painted by Puvis de Chavannes. Those two are painted by Maurice Denis. And there's the Degas, of course. And then on the far right-hand side is a Rousseau. Henri Rousseau. Shukin obviously enjoyed Rousseau because he buys 7 Rousseaus. Henri Rousseau was known as Douanier Rousseau because he was a customs official. He was always an amateur artist. He was about the same age as Monet, never ever made any success in his art, which is strange. I mean, basically what he is, and we can define it now, is he's the first naive painter.